effective governance and institutions. Okay, so we have seen this graph before the break. Now we have discussed this slide: institution, governance, and growth. Okay, so now we move to the next one: favorable environment for private enterprise. So this is because private enterprise is engine of growth. Growth depends on millions of private citizens making decisions to save, invest, work, educate, etc. So pretty much all economic activity. So we need to have a good environment for them to do business, right? Right, and then so depending on which country we look at, so if a country is primarily dominated by agricultural industry, and then agriculture policy will be essential, right? So that's probably in the case of Africa, or this probably is this holds true for most developing countries. So in that sense, we need to have good agriculture policy. So on the other hand, so for those countries, they move up the ladder in terms of economic growth and economic development. So they need to build up their industry. I mean, the heavy industry. And why they need to have heavy industry is because they need industry to provide the machinery, to provide infrastructure, right? So in that sense, in order to foster economic growth, so they may want to have some favorable environment to those heavy industry as well. So that actually happens in the history of most developing countries. Now, so if we have too much regulation, and if we have very weak property rights, that's going to undermine or kill business. So that's linked to the earlier discussion we have regarding the governance, right? And finally, to the degree of openness to international trade and influence matters. So before I show you the graph, now let's see, so why openness and international trade is going to matter. And this is a particularly relevant discussion given today. So instead of talking about globalization, it seems like deglobalization becomes a trend, becomes popular, and particularly in the United States, right? So we talk about deglobalization, we talk about globalization kills domestic job, globalization makes a generation left behind, right? But it's just instead of talk about why deglobalization can create those problems, so we can postpone the discussion for deglobalization until a future chapter. We talk about inequality. Now let's make sure we understand. So why conventional wisdom believe openness and international trade will help economic growth. This is largely because two things. Number one, trade openness is going to help us to take advantage of the idea of specialization. So this specialization is going to advocate our growth in the sense we just show our strength, or we utilize our strengths, right? So this is one aspect. The other aspect is openness and international trade. So allows us to learn from the leader of economic growth, to adapt better technology from advanced economy. So those are at least those are two things you want to keep in mind. One, openness and international trade helps to foster economic growth. And here, so we have three groups of economy. We look at their growth experience in the period 1980 to 1998, so 10 years period. Right. And you can see the open society, their growth rate is significantly higher compared with the closed economy. Right? And here, so what is considered as a closed economy? Give you two examples. Right. So one is North Korea, the other is Cuba. So they consider as closed economy, right? But why they are closed is subject to discussion, whether it's voluntary or involuntary. That's subject to discussion. But the fact is their economy pretty much runs in a closed fashion. And then so you can see, so their growth is negative. but the open economy was considered as open economy. United States, at least at that time period, is fairly open. That most Western European countries, they're open. And in Asia, so in that particular time period, so we have good example of open economy. Think about South Korea, think about Singapore, think about Hong Kong, think about Malaysia, and think Malaysia. Okay, so they just stands short for Malaysia, so they may not be correct, but you know what I'm talking about. And another example, or final example I want to mention is Taiwan. Right, so those are good examples of open economy, right? And then, so again, so they are going to take advantage of specialization. Use Taiwan as example, right? So at that time, they have cheap labor, so they can specialize at labor-intensive industry. Think about textile. Think about assembly line. I mean, it's the computer assembly line, right? So they can specialize so that they can benefit from trade. At the same time, so they learn, they adapt better technology through international trade. So that's why they catch up very quickly, right? So now we move to the next slide. Now, let me just go back. So we have talked about 5 different things, right? So those are 5 common characteristics. Let me see, let me just make sure. So we have covered all of them. So we talk about 5 things. So including governance, including, let me see, including favorable environment, including macro stability, including investment in health and education. Oh, apologize. So the last is, now this is the last factor, favorable geography or location. But now instead of statement, so now there's a question mark. So there's a question mark, meaning so we not sure whether geography or favorable geography and the location help or hurt the economic growth, right? So now let's see. So interestingly, economists find out most developed states are in temperate climate zone. It sounds like suggests, oh, so geography helps. But that means if you have an unfavorable geography, you are doomed? The answer depends, right? So here we have 2 examples. Example number 1, Botswana is landlocked, but it's the most successful country in African economy. And Switzerland and Australia are landlocked, but they are a wealthy country. So that I told you, so I spent 3 years in Switzerland. So Switzerland, so it used to be a very poor country in Western Africa, Western Europe. And Switzerland, so if you have a chance to visit Switzerland, so they are pretty much resource depleted. The only resource they have is just a landscape or the view, right? So, but those are not very productive resources. So in that sense, so Switzerland has very unfavorable geography location. But however, so they have very successful story. On the other hand, so we have countries, those that are in favorable location, but they were not very successful. Now I think about, there are many African countries, they are in coastal line, right? Think about, there are Latin American countries, they are close to the United States. And the particular thing about Mexico, it's a neighbor to the United States, right? So they are not very successful, right? But here, so I want to explain to you why there are economic studies find out temperate climate zone may help economic growth. One theory, yes, question?
I guess, would you be able to elaborate why Mexico is not successful compared to the
compared to the United States?
Yeah, well, I guess compared to somebody else.
So that's a huge discussion. So I guess I probably need to pick my language very carefully, right? So Mexico, I mean, in some sense, is less successful compared to the United States. But as a matter of fact, Mexico, their income is fairly high compared to probably 50% of other countries. So I probably need to pick my word very carefully. So this is number one. And now if you compare Mexico, sorry.
No, thank you.
Yeah, so but secondly, so if when I say Mexico is not that successful, so basically I use the United States as a benchmark, right? Mexico certainly is better than pretty much every single African country, and it's better than most Asian country, right? But so Mexico is a neighbor of the United States, but somehow is lag way behind the United States. And so the answer is very complicated. But so I guess like governance, I guess institution, that probably is the main reason why Mexico lag behind, right? So it seems like Mexico has a corruption issue, no? So that expand a lot of the story why Mexico fall behind. So, but nevertheless, so if any student who are particularly interested in why that's the case, there's one book I can recommend you to read. So this is good. This book is called "Why Country Fails." I believe that's the title. It's written by two economists from MIT. So I believe they focus on institution. They started with their book by describing the stark difference in the region across the border of the United States. Pretty much a town divided by a borderline. Okay, so if you're interested, so you can read that book, right? So again, so I should admit, so I need to pick my language very carefully. So when we talk about this international comparison, because so depending on which benchmark you use. All right. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it made sense. I was just trying to understand what you were comparing it to, or as far as what the U.S. was comparing to Mexico. But no, it makes sense. We do have a lot of corruption out there. So.
Right. Okay. So if I confuse you, so yeah, so I apologize. So if there's any if anything I just said that was inappropriate, right? Anyway, so now we go to next slides, and here just show you the world map, and in some sense show you the importance of geography. But again, in the slide immediately before that one, we have counter example, right? How we read this world map. So the darker the color, the richer the country. Like here, so this part, that's North America. Like here, Australia. Like here, those are Western Europe. All right? And then, so this is equator. This is the equator. Right? And then, so you find out, so near the equator, the climate seems like a little bit harsh. Again, so this probably depending on how you understand harshness, right? So some may say, oh, look at Canada. So the weather is very hard because winter is so brutal, right? But in agriculture economy, or look at human history, so in this part, if we live in near equator, so we have more disease to deal with, and the life expectancy may on average is shorter. And so you have spent a lot of time to fight with those disease and fight to those with unfavorable things, right? So in that sense, it may explain why in the middle, so we have less developing story, right? But again, so in the previous slides, we have seen some outliers. we have same economy here. So yes, in this part, that was pretty much landlocked, right? But still, they managed to do very well, right? So in that sense, geography matters, but that's not a determinant of your successful story. Another thing I want to show you, so this part, like in the equator, I believe that's or somewhere. So I believe Singapore is around, is in that region. And you can see, so Singapore is a successful story, even though they near that region. All right. Okay, so we finished these 5 common characteristics among fast-growing countries. Now, all right, so here is, it's just summarize the last factor, geography, right? Now we have a case study. So this case study trying to understand or trying to tell a story, why is Botswana successful? So I leave that for you. In Canvas, I have a PDF file for you to read. That is a supplemental book that give you all the necessary, all the required case study you can find out. So does anyone trying to locate that file in the Canvas? Anybody?
I'm looking at it right now. Is it under readings?
Yeah, it's under reading, yes.
Okay.
You found the file, right? Or I can show you. So did you find that?
I haven't found it yet. Nothing. What's it called?
Let me see. So Canvas, let me log into my Canvas. In the meantime, so
I found one that says readings. Is that the one you're referring to?
I believe so. This is like a big, it's a big PDF file.
Yeah, it has different one. It has Gary Becker concept of humanity.
Oh, no, let me just, okay, just give me a second. Oh, so additional reading. If you go to the homepage of your class, it's called additional reading. That's called a case study. And the case study, there's a file. Here is a case study from the book by Todaro and Smith. You click that file, and then you're going to see a PDF file.
Yeah, I see it.
Okay, it's like 200 pages. Okay, so whenever we have case study like in slides, so that refers to this supplementary reading. So you can just look at the details of those each countries. Okay, so let's see. I doubt we have time to discuss this case study today. So because we have more material to discuss. If we have extra time, so we will come back. Otherwise, please read the PDF file on Canvas, so that help you to understand the institutional details and the history regarding to those countries. All right. Now we move to the second big part of this chapter. Okay? So we want to understand, essentially, the goal here is we need to understand the growth accounting. But we just split this big task in 2 parts. First, I'm going to explain to you the production function. So this production function is going to be the key to understand economic growth that we are going to discuss next class, right? But today we just take the production function as given and the dynamics of the production function as given, and we just look at given this production function and given the economy is going to behave as the production function described, how we are going to decompose the observed economic growth into different factors. All right. Okay, let's start with factor accumulation. All right. So what is factor accumulation? Factor accumulation is increase in the size of capital stock and the labor force. Okay, but then so what is capital stock and what is labor force? So capital stock and labor force, these two are factors, but these are the factor for what? These are the factor for output. Okay, but this output essentially is a measure for GDP growth. Okay, let me just forward, right? So this is just backward. So we cares or we are interested in understanding GDP growth or economic growth. But the GDP, one way to look at GDP is look at output, how much we produced, right? And output is going to determine by what? Determine factors, because those factors is going to produce output. Okay? And then, so what is considered as a factor? And a factor includes capital stock and the labor force. All right? So to understand or to make sense of all of these, so the key lies here, lies the relationship between output and a factor. And this relationship between output and factor is summarized by this equation. On the left-hand side, this is Q, which is output. On the right-hand side, we have factor. Right? So in order to reach economic growth, we must have growth in output. But the output growth coming from where? Coming from changes a factor or change from factor accumulation. Right? And then so next, we must understand how output link with factor or how factor contribute to output. All right. So to move to the next slides, I want to emphasize productivity growth. So what is productivity? So productivity essentially is output we look at here. Okay? But this productivity, the reason why we use productivity is, okay, so we look at per worker or per unit term. Now this is similar to the discussion we had earlier between aggregate GDP and a per capita GDP. We want to look at per capita term so that make the comparison meaningful, right? Okay, so again, so summarize, productivity is just per capita output. This is equivalent. Right? Okay, so the last sentence in this slide is, so what can lead to productivity growth? Okay, and so so you have factor accumulation. On the other hand, so you have here technology change or greater efficiency or specialization. But both these we can summarize as technology, but different aspect of technology. Right? So this technology change, you may think about, okay, so it's like a machine, you have better machine. Greater efficiency or specialization, you may think about this is how we organize our workplace. We have better management. Right? So this is how we start our discussion, but eventually we want to understand what contributes to economic growth. But we start with this production function here at the bottom. All right. Now, here, so I'm using a graph to explain this production function, or Q equal to if, and we have factor, right? So there are two factors. One is capital. The other is labor. But later, so we may add technology. Let's use A. So A stands for technology. So I believe most of you have seen this in your principle of macroeconomics, right? So Q is output, and the K is capital. L is labor. Lastly, A stands for technology, right? And in the previous slide, so we understand, so what we really care is per capita output. So this means we need to normalize everything in per capita term. Once we normalize everything in per capita term, you are going to see, so these things are going to disappear. And then this is going to convert into per capita capital, convert to here. And in these slides, I'm going to keep technology constant or exogenous. Now in these slides, we are going to show the relationship between, let's use lowercase q and the k. Okay, what is k? K is per capita capital. What is q? Q essentially is productivity. But what's productivity? It's just per worker output. And then remember, so throughout the discussion in this slide and the following slides, we may keep or leave a constant. All right, so that's how we start our discussion. So now let me erase everything I wrote. Let's just focus on the relationship between, use the language we just said, between K and lowercase q. Remember, Q is output per worker. That's a measure of productivity. Lowercase k is capital. That's essentially, that's a factor. All right, and then so the relationship between K and Q will look like this curve, and we call this concave curve. And so here we have two different concave curve, right? And how we understand this, and why, particularly why the curve is concave. By the way, here when I say concave, just meaning so the slope of this curve is decreasing, right? Okay, so to understand what this concave curve means, and to understand why you have a decrease in slope of this curve, first let's see what this slope is measuring. Okay. So this slope actually is measuring MPK, but what is MPK? It's a marginal productivity or marginal product of capital. And what is the marginal product of capital? It just says if the capital per worker increased by 1 unit, how much does the productivity increase? All right, so this is the slope. Now the slope is decreasing, meaning so once you add more and more capital, the additional capital is going to bring you less and less additional productivity. And then so what explains the decrease in marginal productivity of capital? The simple explanation goes as follows. Just imagine if you have if you move from taking public transportation to own your first car. So with no surprise, your mobility increased dramatically and your productivity is going to increase a lot because you do not have to wait. You just go and can go anywhere you want, anytime. Now just imagine what would be the extra gain if you bought another car for yourself. The gain will be very, very low. Most of the time, the second car won't bring you any extra benefit. Right? So that explains the decrease in marginal productivity of capital. Another example, you think about the workplace. So once we install more capital, the workplace can start to get crowded. Right? So that can reduce the marginal productivity of capital. Okay, and okay, so just keep this decrease in marginal productivity of capital in mind, because that's going to lead to a future discussion. Why poor country is going to grow faster. The reason why poor country grow faster has lots to do with this graph. It's because poor country, and usually they have lower capital per worker, meaning their marginal productivity of capital is going to be higher. Meaning, so invest $1, that's going to bring much higher marginal return, which translates into higher rate of growth. Okay, so we will come back that discussion again in the future. Okay, so this is how the production function looks like. Okay, in general case. Okay, let's just show you the relationship between capital per worker and output per worker. But again, the output per worker is equivalent to GDP per worker. Because one way to look at GDP is just look at output. Right? Those are the same stuff we discuss in principle from macroeconomics. All right. So what do we mean growth? Right? So one way to get growth is move along this line. Right? Because meaning so you have more factor you can use to produce. The other way we get growth is through technology progress, more specifically, right? So basically we move from this line to the dark line, right? The difference between this, I guess this is called blue, not blue, green line, dark green line, to this solid black line. What's the difference? The difference is for any given level of capital or given amount of factor. Okay? So this black solid line produce higher amount of output. And why they can produce higher amount of output is because their productivity level is higher. That's one explanation. All right. Okay. So from here, to summarize, there are two ways to achieve growth, or two ways to gain productivity. One, by increasing factor. The other is so we have better technology. Okay. So we just talked about decreasing marginal productivity of capital. So it's here. So that just refers to the decreasing slope of the production function. And this has some very important implications regarding to understanding economic growth. As I just said, poor countries are going to have a potential to grow more rapidly because they have lower stock of capital, or we call capital scarcity. This capital scarcity is going to imply higher MPK. Higher MPK is going to translate into higher growth. This is the first implication. The other side of the first implication is richer country with capital abundant will grow slowly. This opposite story is because they have lower MPK coming from higher capital, right? And finally, so if we combine these two together, an important implication is that poor country will catch up with rich country because poor country will grow faster. Example, China, India, they are going to catch up with United States and a Western European country. Okay, but however, there's a big catch or big caveat in this statement. Here we assume whether you're a poor country or a rich country, you have the same level of A or the same evolution of A. But this is not a reasonable assumption, right? So basically, United States, they not only have capital abundant, they also have better technology. And later on, we may want to interpret it in a very broader sense. It not only includes technology, it also includes institutions. Think about free speech, think about stable political system, so on and so forth, or stable laws, or the strong protection of property rights. So that all goes into A in a broader sense. It is not reasonable to assume a poor country has similar A as rich country. If we factor that in, you're going to reach a very different conclusion. Instead of catch-up, this is going to have a permanent gap between rich country and a poor country. In the next slide, in the next chapter, we will have more detailed discussion regarding to this convergence. All right, any question? Okay, so now, given the discussion of the production function, now we can look at key elements of economic growth. Okay, so the way to understand economic growth is to interpret this as growth in Q. And the reason why we can do that is because, so one way to look at GDP is to look at how much you produce. And furthermore, economic growth essentially is growth in per capita GDP. So that's how we link to the discussion we just had in previous slides. Okay, now, so in the previous slides, we understand Q, or productivity, is going to be determined by two things, either factor or through technology progress. Now again, so this technology progress, we must interpret it, or we must understand that in a broader sense. Not only include the traditional technology, also includes institutions, governance. All right? Okay, so now start with factors. So key factor is capital, right? Because labor becomes less relevant because now we look at per capita. So everything must denominate by labor or by population. If that's the case, we must focus on what can affect the capital stock. But again, it's per capita stock, right? And then, so capital stock can be increased or can be generated through investment, right? But that's where does investment coming from? In a closed economy, so let me emphasize, closed economy, meaning there's no foreign direct investment, okay? Or there is no grant, no foreign aid. In a closed economy, investment must come from domestic saving. But where does saving come from? Saving coming from your income. Now, so you have income, you either spend or save. Okay, and towards this end, so you're going to see, so your output grow depending on your investment. Investment depending on saving, but saving eventually depending on your income. So you can see there's a closed loop, right? Okay. But either this investment decision, saving decision, so on and so forth, those decisions are made by private and public sectors, including consumer firms, corporations, and governments. Okay? And towards the end, so in order to achieve sustainable growth, we must require two things. First, we can generate new investment through saving, and furthermore through increasing income. Secondly, we must make sure it is productive and it is employment creating, or in other words, so that's going to further increase future productivity. Right? So save is not enough. If you save and invest in backwater of the economy, instead it brings you economic growth, it may slow down your economic growth. Or in other words, think about extreme case because of the corruption. So the money we save goes towards some sector or some aspect of the economy that's going to slow down growth. Right? So the money just goes to bureaucracy. The money goes to better building for federal agency. So that's not going to help us to achieve productive future economic growth. Okay? Now, given this discussion, so we are going to do the growth accounting, right? And so we have one big question in homework 1. So as I ask you to do a similar exercise as I'm going to explain to you in the following slides. The starting point is solo growth models, but we have not explained solo growth model yet. This is the main topic for the next chapter. But for now, we just take the solo model and its conclusion as given. We want to see how to use this solo model to understand the growth phenomena we observe. Right. So the main sense from solo growth model says the growth must come from either one of the following 3 components, either through capital accumulation, or through employment, or through productivity gain. Okay? Those are the 3 sources that can contribute to economic growth. In solo growth model, so we have a consistent theory to explain to you how each of those factors can actually bring you economic growth measured by increasing output, and how they interact each other, and how their dynamics looks like. And from those discussions, you can see at least 2 things. Number 1, how we can have better policy to achieve long-run economic growth. And number 2, how the economy is going to behave over the long run. And so those are 2 different aspects. But those are the things we are going to discuss in next chapter. For now, let's take the conclusion or take the insight from solo growth model as given. See what we can use the solo growth model to understand the observed economic growth, or maybe get some insights. All right. Our starting point is going to be this equation in the middle. Okay. There are a few things from this equation. Number 1, growth coming from 3 sources. Right? On the left-hand side is GDP growth of income. Y stands for income or output. G stands for growth rate. So it's on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, you can see, just following the discussion we just had, there are three sources of growth. You either have, let's use different color. Either we have growth in capital accumulation, or there's an increase in employment. And finally, we have productivity. Right? So there are three sources. Okay? And then, so we have another sense from this equation. This equation says, so each factor we just talked about, right, is 1, 2, and 3. These three factors, their contribution to economic growth or growth in income are different. Different in terms, there's a weight in front of them. All right, so in front of capital, there's a weight WK. There's another weight WN. Right? And then finally, so you can think there's a weight in front of A, but that's normalized equal to 1. Okay? So how we understand these three different weights? Okay. Start with 1. Why we pick the weight for productivity as 1? Okay. So in order to answer that part, I need to explain to you what productivity really means in this theory. Okay. If we look at real economy, or if we look at actual data, so we can observe following things. We can observe GDP. We can observe capital stock. And we can observe employment, or in other words, we can observe labor. Those are the things we can observe, right? So GDP, so you probably heard about these terms frequently on news, right? So in principle, macroeconomics, we have devoted a lot of time to understand how to measure GDP and what does GDP means. Let's check that. Capital. Capital primarily means physical capital. Just think about the building we have at UNO. Just think about cars, think about machineries, think about the computers, cell phones, so on and so forth we have. So those are considered capital. Yes, accounting can be challenging, can be tedious, but we can measure in capital. So let's check the other one. Employment. So if we look at individual workers, you can ask yourself how many hours you work, whether it is productive or less productive. You have a number. And then so in aggregate, so you know how many people are working every day, every month, every quarter, every year. And then so from those numbers, what are we going to get? We are going to have a number, how many hours the country has worked as a whole, right? So that's employment. We can check that, right? But now lastly, can you really understand or measure in technology level? And can you really measure in the governance, the efficiency of governance or effectiveness of governance? Or can we observe? The answer is negative, unfortunately. But we know there's something very important besides capital, besides employment. We know there's something very powerful that's going to determine how we produce, how much we can produce, and why there's such a difference between the productivity from between productivity in one country and the other. We know that. But unfortunately, we do not have a direct measure. So in that sense, that's why we need a growth accounting. Also, that's why we need this equation. Right? So what's the next step to understand this? So I just told you, so you can measure in GDP, you can measure in capital, you can measure in employment. And also you can measure in their growth rate. Right? And from the theory, we know, okay, so the growth of output must come in from either one of those three factors, meaning capital, right? Meaning capital, meaning labor, and meaning productivity. All right? So now we're going to write this equation. Okay, once we assign the weight here, right? Assign weight here and here. So I still owe you an explanation where these two weights coming from. But I hope so now you have a sense of what this means, right? So essentially they just summarize everything we cannot directly observe. So for example, you know a weight here. So for example, this is like 1, this is 1. Right? That just means, okay, so output growth is going to be coming from capital growth 1 by 1, employment growth 1 by 1, and the rest goes to this unobservable productivity growth. Right? So if you understand that, and then you should understand, so there's no point to put another weight in front of here, because whatever, this is not what we can observe. Right? And then the total number we left unexplained by the first two terms. Let me refresh, just erase this. So we're saying, so you observe this, the output growth, you observe capital growth, you observe employment growth, right? And then we just realize our limitation or our ignorance. We cannot observe this A. And then so we are going to do the following. So we say, okay, so we measure the growth of output by looking at how much explained by capital, how much explained by employment, and the rest, everything goes to A. So if that's the case, there's no point to assign additional weight on productivity. Right? So I hope you understand that part. Now, if you understand that part, so now we need to explain where does this weight coming from and where does this weight coming from. All right? Okay, so let's start with capital. So the weight in front of capital we call share of capital. But the precise name for this is the share of capital contribution to output. Okay, let me write down. Share of capital contribution to output. Right? So what that means? Now think about the individual business. For any business, every year they generate some revenue or profit, either way. Right? In economics, so in some sense we blur the difference. Right? So let's just say, for example, profit of a business. Okay, or the income we generate from the business. Okay? So this profit or income eventually will pay off through two ways. One, so this income the business generate must pay the cost of using capital. And the other part of the income generated by the business must go to pay for the labor they hire. And then in our principal economics, we know economic profit equal to zero, meaning everything we produce, every income we generate through business will be exhausted by the payment to factors, including capital and labor. So this is for individual business. Now, if we look at macroeconomy, this must also hold true, meaning any single year, any point of time, what the economies produce or what income the economy generates eventually will paid as two part and will be exhausted. Either it goes to pay the cost of using capital or pay to the cost of using labor. Right? Now, given this observation, we can interpret the income goes to capital and the income goes to labor as a share of contribution that goes to here. Right? Because this income must reflect their contribution. And then, so essentially, this WK is what? WK is, if we look at aggregate economy, is use income as a denominator. Pay as numerator. What is pay to factor? If we talk about WK and then it's pay to capital. If we talk about WN, it's pay to labor. Those things we can observe, and those things is going to add up equal to income. Okay, just remind yourself how we look at GDP in principal class. Right, so in principal class, GDP can either look at total income, or we can look at total product we produce, or finally we can look at it, total consumption. Okay, they will add up equal to each other. And here we just look at the equivalent between income and product. Right? So the product is give you the income, total income, or how much you have produced. And then so this product or income is going to divide into two type of income. One is income to capital, the other is income to labor. Right? So that explains what is WK. WK essentially is income goes to capital, but that's give you a measure the contribution of capital to how much we produce. All right. So now is a good time to erase everything. Just zoom into this equation. Now I hope soon you have a sense of what this means. To summarize, so this equation just tells you how to decompose economic growth on the left-hand side. Into the growth in three different things on the right-hand side, including capital, including employment or labor, including productivity. All right. So this is growth accounting or source of growth analysis. We just trying to understand where does this growth coming from. To what extent this growth coming from capital accumulation, and to what extent this growth coming from employment growth, and finally to what extent this growth coming from productivity growth. Okay, so this is a source of growth analysis. Any question? Any question regarding to this? This is a long discussion. Yes.
Yeah, so in terms of our questions, for example, like our homework and on our exams, will we ever be given a situation where the weights aren't given to us and we have to somehow figure them out, or will it be very clear?
Excellent question. So most of the time, the weight are given. Now let's go to next example to reinforce what I just explained. But that's a perfect question that really helps me to explain. Okay, so now go to examples. Okay. Example: Assume you observe a country grow 5% per year. And at the same time period, you find out the capital accumulation grow by 7% per year. Employment. Remember here, it's the N. More precisely, this is a total hours. Let me write down total hours worked. All right. So it means the hours each worker work, we add them together. Okay. Next class. So once you get your hands wet or your feet wet by looking at the data. So I'm going to give you a more detailed explanation how you actually construct such data. But for now, just keep in mind. So this total hours the country has worked. Now, second thing you observe, this number grow by 2%. Now we assign a weight of 60% to capital and 40% to labor. Okay, these two things are given. But in your homework in exam, so you're supposed to calculate these three numbers by looking at data. All right. So now we are going to substitute into the equation we have seen before, right, in the previous slide. All right. And so here in this slide, there's one thing is missing. Actually, so you need to back out A. You need to back out. Because as I just explained in the previous slide, you do not directly observe a country's A. You only observe following things. Let me repeat. You observe income. You observe capital stock. You observe total hours work, but not A. But in the homework and in the future exam, so I'm going to tell you how you calculate A. Actually, there's a formula tells you A, let me just spell out. So Y divided by K and WK times N WN. So the letter may look slightly different, but the idea is the same. So essentially from here, you can say A is measuring what? Measuring whatever cannot be explained by capital and labor. Does that make sense? Because you observe income, right? So income is going to come in from three sources. Remember, so we have early equation Y is going to determined by, let's use, I just abuse the notation a little bit. So it's going to determine by K, N, and we have A, right? So that's what we discussed earlier. And I hope you understand the economics behind that. So essentially it says, okay, so capital is going to help you to build your product. Labor, you need labor to produce. And finally, it's A is going to help you to produce better or worse, right? But unfortunately, in reality, we do not observe A directly. But this just tells you, this economics tells you how you back out A. All right. So if you don't mind, let me just erase everything from here. Let's just focus on the second part. Now we are here. Now we are here. Okay. So on top of this information I just explained to you, those are what you can directly observe from actual data. On top of those, you back out A and you find out the growth rate of A. Right? And then so you plug into this. And then, so what are you going to have? You're going to have left-hand side 0.5. And then so you plug in this number, plug in this number. And finally, you get this number.
Question.
Yes.
On your WK, the 0.4, isn't that WN?
Yes, thank you. So
Okay.
that's a typo. Yeah, this is supposed to be like 0.4,
Yep, figure that.
0.6. Yeah, so that's a typical number we've seen in the data. Right. So why not you guys work on the homework and spend some time looking the data, and then so next time when we have a class, I can explain to you a little bit. Because I think today I have lectured too much, so you may start to get lost. So in the homework, I believe I have very detailed instruction to tell you how to mechanically work out. But today's lecturing just kind of help you to make sense of those instructions. Why not you just work on homework, and so I can explain to you a little bit more so that you understand why we do what we're supposed to do. Okay? So, right, so for new material, let me just finish the following few slides, and then so we have other two things to discuss, as I mentioned in the beginning of the class, right? So this is the production function. Now, so you probably have seen before, but here, so A essentially corresponds to WK, and 1 minus A corresponds to, so this A corresponds to WK, and this 1 minus A corresponds to WN. All right, for students, I think for grad students, you should realize the following things. So F equal to MPK times K plus MPN times N. And furthermore, you should realize MPK times K divided by F equal to A or WK, however you like. At the same time, MPN times N divided by F equal to 1 minus A or WN. Okay, and then so just stare at the left-hand side of this equation. What does this mean? So this literature tells you the contribution of capital to total income or total output, right? So F is the total output. MPK times K is what you paid for using capital. But in economics, this is the equilibrium model. So what you pay must equal to what you contribute, right? And your contribution divided by the total output. So that's going to give your contribution, your share of contribution to the economy. All right. So now we are going to expand these things a little bit by including Z, and we are going to plug in the actual shares from what we observed in the data. Again, so this 0.36 coming from where? Mathematically coming from MPK times K divided by Y, which is the GDP. But in reality, in the data, what is equal to? This is equal to Y is what you measure GDP. And here, essentially, we just look at tax return, look at capital income. So this is how we connect with data. And this gives you 0.36. Similarly, you can find out how we get 0.64. Now, I want to emphasize Z. Why there's a Z is because, unfortunately or fortunately, so when we look at the data, look at Y on the left-hand side and the KN on the right-hand side, you find out pretty much throughout the history, so Y does not exactly equal to the product, these two. There's a gap. And this gap, we label as Z, or sometimes we label as A, or even sometimes we label this as TFP, total factor of productivity. But in either way, so this gap we called productivity. but also this is a measurement of our ignorance. And why we call this ignorance? This is because we know there's something beyond capital and labor that's going to contribute to our production, but we do not know who they are. And we just call them productivity. We pretend we know them as productivity, and we pretend to know them as technology. But essentially, the number is just measuring our ignorance of the underlying mechanism of our economy. And here, so this growth accounting is trying to attribute the observed GDP growth into each factors. 1, 2, 3. Right? Okay, so this is literally how you get this number, this Z from data. And the hat essentially is referring to the data. Okay. And this is how the Z look like in actual economy. But the level doesn't tell us much. The real meaning of Z coming from the growth rate. Again, so I prefer you work on the data, and when we meet again next time, so I may have to, most likely I will quickly walk you through these slides again to make sure we understand. Okay, so let's leave this for next discussion. Right. So, okay, let me leave this for next class. Now, let's quickly discuss the other two things. One is homework. Let me just go to my, let me show you the homework. Assignment 1. So this one, right? Okay, so you have 3 weeks to work on, but the earlier the better. Let's start with the first one. Of the table on page comparison of GMP, that's in the introduction. Okay, I already told you which slide was that. So what you need to do is find a good data source. Find a good data source, all right? And so in terms of data source, you can use a data source in footnote 1 or footnote 2. Any question, has it? Okay, I guess no one has tried this data source yet. But please spend some time to play around with these two data websites, right? And so you have a sense of how data looks like. This is the first question. Now go to the second question. So the second question is pretty much just following the discussion we just had today, but we have not 100% finished yet. Okay, for you, because we won't have a class next week, we are going to see each other in 2 weeks. So you have 2 weeks time. So I would strongly suggest you start to dive into the data. Okay, at least you should start to get data on the first part, or you should start with the first part. This here. By looking at this, by looking at those two data sources I cited. Yeah, but then so you may spend some time to figure out which data you must use for capital stock and which data you must use for labor supply. For GDP, it's straightforward. But for capital stock and labor supply, it can be very tricky. You may want to review your principal macroeconomic class to understand so which statistics you may want to use to measure capital stock and labor supply. Right? So in the following 2 weeks before we meet each other in next class, so I wish you have a good sense of the data. So if you can do that, that is going to be a big achievement. But if you're ambitious enough, you work hard enough, you can keep going. In the meantime, if you have any question, you can send me email. Does that sound good?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay. Other things I want to emphasize is we must work earlier as possible as we can to think about how we are going to do the group presentation. I think right now is a good time. Can anyone right now quickly create a Google Doc and send to the chat, and so we can start to figure out how we are going to do the group presentation. Basically, so you just need a we just need a Google Doc has two columns. One is your name. No, I mean three columns. One is your name. Secondly, so which group you want, and the third, I'm going to assign the topic to each group. Sounds good? Anybody can do this quickly for me? Just a Google Doc, like Excel, Google Sheet with three columns. Your name, your group number, and the topic. The first, you just write down your name, and then so I give you guys 1 or 2 weeks to sort out which group you want to work out. In the meantime, I'm going to copy paste those questions on the Google Sheet so that you can choose which topic you want to work on. Is that clear? Is anybody working on this? Or if not, I can create a Google Sheet and send to you through email later. Either way.
I think it might be best if you send it, because I was looking at my access on Canvas, and I only can see the graduate students that are in the course. I can't see the undergraduate due to the course number.
Fine. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Then don't worry. So I will send you by the middle of this week. If I forgot to send you by the end of the week, then just please send me an email to remind me. All right.
Okay.
Any question before we close for tonight? So I think, yes, tonight so we have quite intensive discussion regarding this growth model. My past experience is some students get discouraged, get scared. So I always want to tell you, so don't scare away, just simply because some of the discussion make you feel lost, just don't worry. So we will quickly pass through this storm, right? Because at the end, what we want is to understand the international experience in terms of economic growth. So this economic theory, or the theory behind economic growth, is useful, but it shouldn't become a hurdle for you to finish the class. All right? So if you feel the discussion too intense or too intimidating, it is normal to not give up. We will be okay. Right? Question? Don't be shy.
I have a question, but it's not related to the class, so whenever everybody's done.
Okay, so I guess you can speak up.
I guess regarding accessing you, can we email you, and would you be available for a Zoom meeting on one-on-one if we needed you?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. So yes, I am available for one-to-one meeting. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I will do my best to accommodate you. So as long as yeah, I should say that. Okay, so it should be okay. So I should be able to meet. I mean, typically, so in my previous class, I asked each student to meet with me at least once a semester. Yeah, so that shouldn't be a problem. Any other question? No? If not, and then, so have a good evening and see you in 2 weeks, right? So we won't have class. Okay, so during the time, just please start working on the data. So this is a good time for you to look at this data. In some sense, this data is kind of, this data experience is independent of the theory. Right, so this is a good time for you to practice. All right?
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, see you guys later.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye-bye.